I was still in uniform when my father told me my leg wasn't worth $5,000. The doctor had just said the word disability not as a threat, but as a fact if surgery didn't happen soon. My phone was pressed to my ear, my boot half unlaced my knee, swollen so badly the fabric strained. On the other end of the line, my mother sighed. My sister laughed. And my father said calmly, almost kindly, "Sweetheart, we just bought a boat. This isn't a good time." That was the moment something inside me went quiet. I was stationed 2 hours from home when it happened during a routine training exercise that was supposed to be boring. We'd done it dozens of times before, movement under load-controlled pace, nothing dramatic. I remember the sound first, a sharp, wet pop that didn't belong in a human body. Then the heat, then the ground rushing up too fast. Pain in the military isn't new. You learn early how to separate discomfort from danger. This was different. This was the kind of pain that steals your breath and replaces it with white noise. I tried to stand. My leg buckled like it wasn't mine anymore. The medic knelt beside me, fingers already pressing, eyes narrowing. "Don't move," he said, not gently, seriously. At the clinic, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead while I lay on a narrow bed, my uniform cut at the knee. My leg was swelling by the minute skin, tight and shiny, turning colors I didn't have words for. Purple, yellow, something darker underneath. The physician's assistant didn't sugarcoat it. "You've got significant ligament damage." "Possibly more," she said, tapping the screen where my MRI glowed. "You need surgery, soon." "How soon?" I asked. She paused. That pause told me everything. "This week," she said. "If you wait, you're looking at long-term impairment, limping, limited mobility, maybe permanent." I nodded like she'd just told me the weather. The problem wasn't the surgery, the problem was approval. Anyone who served knows the waiting game. Forms, reviews, authorizations, someone else's signature standing between you and your own body. The earliest the military medical system could approve the procedure was weeks out, weeks I didn't have. The PA lowered her voice. "If you can do this off base," she said carefully, "you should." "How much?" I asked. She wrote the number on a scrap of paper and slid it across the tray. $500. That was just the upfront cost, the down payment on being able to walk normally again. That night, I sat on the edge of my bunk, my leg wrapped in thick gauze, my boot on the floor like an abandoned shell. Around me, the barracks were loud laughter music, someone yelling over a video game. Life going on. I stared at my phone for a long time before I called home. My father answered on the third ring. "Hey, kiddo," he said, cheerful, distracted. I could hear something metallic in the background. Tools. Or maybe the television. "Dad," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "I got hurt. It's bad." He listened as I explained. I kept it clinical. Injury, surgery, timeline, cost. I told him I'd pay it back. I told him I just needed help now. There was silence. Then a familiar sound, the exhale he always made before saying no. "We just bought the boat," he said. "You know that. The timing's terrible." I closed my eyes. "It's my leg," I said. "If I don't do this, I might not walk right again." "Well," he replied, "you're young, you'll adapt." My mother picked up the extension. She always did that when things got uncomfortable. "Honey," she said softly, "maybe this is a lesson. You chose this career, you chose the risks. A limp will teach responsibility," she added, as if she were talking about a parking ticket. Then my sister's voice cut in, bright and amused. "Relax," she said. "You always figure things out. You're the tough one, remember?" She laughed, actually laughed. I looked down at my leg, at the blood soaking through the gauze, staining the clean white into something ugly and real. I thought of the doctor's words. Permanent. "I understand," I said. And I did, completely. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I hung up the phone and sat there in the noise of the barracks, feeling something inside me settle into place. Cold, clear. 2 days later, I was back in my tiny off-base apartment, moving on crutches every step, a reminder of what was at stake. The pain meds dulled the edge, but not the fear. I ran numbers over and over in my head. Credit cards, payday loans, anything that could buy me time. There was a knock at the door. I opened it to find my brother standing there, grease-stained jacket, dark circles under his eyes. He worked at a mechanic shop outside town. 60 hours a week, minimum wage, hands permanently scarred. He looked at my leg and swore under his breath. They didn't help you, he said. Not a question. I shook my head. Without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of bills. 10s, 20s, crumpled and worn. He pressed them into my hand. 800, he said. I sold my tools, all of them. I stared at him. You need those, I said. I need you walking, he replied. I'll figure the rest out. My parents had assets, savings, equity, a boat they'd named after a vacation spot they'd only been to once. My brother had nothing. And he gave me everything. I took the money. Not because it was enough. It wasn't even close. I took it because I needed to remember this moment. Needed to remember who showed up when I was bleeding. As he left, he squeezed my shoulder. You'll be okay, he said. You always are. He didn't know what was coming next. But I did. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of the pain, though it throbbed in slow, deliberate waves, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying old scenes I'd worked hard to forget. Moments I'd told myself didn't matter, proof I'd buried under discipline and duty. When you grow up in a family like mine, you learn early how to label yourself. My sister was the investment. My parents said it openly without shame. She had potential. She needed support. Every misstep was framed as a temporary setback on the road to something great. I was the reliable one, the one who didn't ask, the one who figured it out. When my sister dropped out of her first business venture, an online boutique that burned through $15,000 in 6 months, my father wrote a check without blinking. No questions, no contracts, no lectures. My mother called it helping her find her footing. When the second venture failed, a wellness studio with more mirrors than clients, my parents refinanced part of the house to keep it afloat. You have to spend money to make money, my father said proudly, like he was quoting scripture. I remember sitting at the kitchen table during one of those conversations, quietly eating cereal after a 12-hour shift at my first civilian job before I enlisted. I didn't say anything. I just watched. When I was 22, my car's transmission went out. I needed $2,000 to get it fixed so I could commute. I asked my parents for a loan, not a gift, a loan. They agreed on conditions. My father printed out a contract from his office. Interest included, 5%. My mother insisted we get it notarized. It's important to be formal, she said. It builds character. For 6 months, I ate canned food and walked miles to save on gas. I paid them back early, honestly believing that responsibility would earn respect. It didn't. It just set the standard for how much I could be expected to endure without complaint. Now, sitting in my apartment with my leg elevated on mismatched pillows, that pattern finally made sense. This wasn't about money. It never had been. They had money. They just didn't have it for me. The next morning, I called the military hospital again. The answer hadn't changed. Approval was still pending. Timelines were still under review. Time I didn't have. I stared at my phone at the contact list at numbers I'd never wanted to use. Payday lenders, high-interest personal loans, the kind of places that smile too wide and speak too softly. I went anyway. The office smelled like cheap coffee and desperation. The man across the desk spoke in calm, rehearsed sentences, while his computer calculated how much of my future I was trading for my present. The interest rate was obscene. The repayment schedule cruel. Do you understand the terms, he asked? Yes, I said. I signed. The surgery was scheduled for 2 days later. The morning of the procedure, I lay on a gurney staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the cracks like they might tell me something important. A nurse adjusted my IV. The anesthesiologist asked me to count backward. As the world faded, I thought of my father's voice. We just bought a boat. When I woke up, my leg was wrapped in layers of bandages and metal. The pain was sharp but clean, like something had finally been set right. The surgeon came by later and confirmed what I already felt. We got it in time, he said. You'll recover fully if you follow rehab. Relief washed through me so fast it almost hurt. Recovery, however, didn't come with financial mercy. The first loan payment was due in 3 days. I checked my bank account. $47 and some change. My paycheck wouldn't hit for another week. I started doing math that didn't add up, moving numbers around like they might magically cooperate. I considered selling plasma. I considered selling furniture. I considered things I'm not proud of. And then I remembered something small and stupid. The receipt in my jacket pocket, from the gas station near the pharmacy. I'd bought a bottle of water, some crackers, and a lottery ticket, a reflex purchase, a joke I made to myself while waiting for pain meds. I pulled it out and smoothed it on the table, opened the app on my phone, read the numbers once, then again. I didn't scream, I didn't laugh. I just sat there listening to the refrigerator hum, feeling my heartbeat slow. It wasn't a headline jackpot, it wasn't fireworks. But it was enough. Enough to breathe, enough to think. Enough to stop being desperate. I didn't tell anyone. Instead, I called a lawyer. Not the kind with a billboard and a jingle, the kind who works in a glass building downtown and charges by the hour because his time is expensive for a reason. When I rolled into his office on crutches, I looked like someone who'd taken a wrong turn in life. He didn't comment, he just listened. I want two things, I said when I finished. I want my assets protected, and I want to understand my parents' finances better than they do. He studied me for a long moment. That second part, he said, carefully changes things. I know, I replied, that's why I'm here. As I left his office, my phone buzzed, a text from my brother. How's the leg? I typed back. Getting there, thanks again. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a joke about borrowing my crutches if his knee went out. He had no idea what I was about to do, and I wasn't ready to tell him. The paperwork took longer than the pain. That surprised me. I'd expected the physical recovery to be the hard part, the slow grinding work of learning to trust my leg again. Instead, it was the waiting rooms, the signatures, the calls that never got returned. The world of forms and fine print was colder than any operating table. The loan payments began exactly when they said they would. No grace period, no understanding, just automated withdrawals that didn't care whether I was still on crutches or sleeping on my couch because the bed was too far from the bathroom. Every month, half my income disappeared before I could touch it. I tightened everything. No streaming services, no eating out. I counted grocery items like they were ammunition, rice, beans, eggs. I learned which pain days I could skip the medication and which ones I couldn't. And I healed. Slowly, methodically, the way the military teaches you to do everything one controlled movement at a time. Physical therapy became my anchor. The room always smelled faintly of disinfectant and rubber mats. My therapist, an older man with a quiet voice and steady hands, never rushed me. You don't need to prove anything here, he told me once as I struggled through a set of balance drills. Your body's not your enemy. I wanted to believe him. Between sessions, I met with my lawyer. His office overlooked the city, all glass and steel and quiet confidence. He never raised his voice, never overpromised. He just asked precise questions and waited for precise answers. 3 days after my first visit, he slid a thick folder across his desk. This, he said, is the story your parents tell themselves. I opened it. The myth unraveled fast. The house I'd grown up in, the one my mother liked to call their nest egg, was leveraged to the edge, refinanced more times than I could count, 3 months behind on payments, final notices buried under unopened mail. The boat not paid for, not even close. The down payment alone sat on a credit card with a brutal interest rate. The rest was financed through a loan that assumed future income that didn't exist. My sister's business bleeding cash, payroll covered by pulling equity out of the house, taxes, complicated in a way that made my lawyer's mouth tighten. They're not wealthy, he said calmly. They're pretending. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. They'd refused me $5,000 to save my leg while setting fire to tens of thousands to preserve appearances. Cruel was one thing, this was something else. Can we protect you from this? My lawyer asked. Shield your assets so you're not exposed when it collapses. I closed the folder. No, I said, I don't want to run from their debt. He raised an eyebrow. I want to own it. That was the moment the plan became real. We moved quickly after that, efficiently, quietly. A company was formed, a name chosen that meant nothing and everything at the same time. No family connections, no personal identifiers, just a clean shell. Through the company, we approached the institutions holding my parents' debt. Banks don't love bad loans, they love clean books, and they'll trade one for the other faster than most people realize. I bought their debt for less than it was worth. Not out of greed, out of clarity. Within 48 hours, I went from being the daughter they dismissed to the entity that owned their house, their loans, their fragile sense of stability. They didn't know. That was the hardest part, to sit with the knowledge that if I walked into their living room and told them the truth, they'd never sign what they were about to sign. They'd cry, they'd plead, they'd rewrite history. So I didn't go as their daughter. I went as opportunity. An intermediary reached out on behalf of my company. Professional, polished, British accent my parents always trusted more than their own instincts. A meeting was set at a private lunch club downtown, the kind of place my father loved because it made him feel important. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I listened later through a recording as the pitch unfolded, how my company specialized in distressed assets, how we saw value in their property, how we believed in retention strategies for families like theirs. A sale and leaseback arrangement, immediate relief, no foreclosure, no public embarrassment. They could stay in the house, maintain their lifestyle, even receive a small line of credit to stabilize operations. My father preened. I could hear it in his voice. My mother asked careful questions, but only about optics, not terms. My sister talked about expansion. The contract was long, 50 pages, dense. Buried inside it was a clause so sharp it might as well have been a blade. Any violation, any late payment, any misuse. Immediate termination, immediate possession. No court delays, no grace. They didn't read it. Why would they? People like my parents never believe the rules are meant for them. When the pen scratched against paper, I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, not joy. Finality. That night, I stood up from the couch without my crutches for the first time. My leg held. I took a careful step, then another. I wasn't limping anymore. And for the first time since the injury, I smiled, not because I'd won, but because I could finally stand on my own. They still thought I was the daughter who'd figure it out. They had no idea what they'd just given me. I didn't rush the next step. That was the discipline the army had burned into me. Move with intention, not impulse. When you hurry, you make noise. When you make noise, people look. And if there was one thing I needed right now, it was silence. From the outside, nothing changed. My parents told friends they'd restructured. They used words like savvy and strategic at dinner parties. My sister posted filtered photos online, champagne flutes, a new bracelet catching the light captioned with vague affirmations about alignment and abundance. They looked lighter, relieved, almost smug. They had no idea they were tenants. I watched from a distance, rebuilding my body while they rebuilt their illusions. Physical therapy progressed from balance boards to resistance bands, from cautious steps to controlled lunges. My therapist nodded approval, then pushed harder. "You're stronger than before," he said one afternoon. "That injury forced you to correct things you didn't even know were off." I understood what he meant. Pain, when addressed, doesn't just heal, it recalibrates. Financially, the same principle applied. Once I owned the debt, the numbers stopped being scary. They became tools. I knew exactly when payments were due, exactly what the margins were, exactly how fragile my parents' situation remained beneath the surface confidence. And fragility has a sound. It's quiet, like glass under pressure. The first sign came when my father called weeks after the deal closed. His tone was casual, rehearsed. "Hey," he said, "just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a while." I kept my voice neutral. "I've been recovering." Right, he said quickly. "Good, that's good." A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, "We've been busy. Meetings, big changes." "I'm glad," I replied. He waited for more, for praise, for curiosity. When it didn't come, he cleared his throat and ended the call. I set the phone down and wrote the date on my calendar. People like my father need witnesses. When you stop reflecting their version of themselves back to them, they get uneasy. They start making mistakes. The intermediary, still their only point of contact with my company, sent monthly compliance summaries. Clean, polite, boring. My parents skimmed them, I'm sure. They always skimmed things that mattered. Late fees were outlined in bold, usage clauses spelled out in plain language. They nodded, smiled, assumed exceptions would be made. Thanksgiving approached, and with it the annual performance. That holiday was sacred in my family, not because of gratitude, but because of presentation. The table had to be perfect, the food excessive, the stories rehearsed. It was the one day a year my parents could prove to themselves and everyone else that they were successful. This year was no different. My sister arrived early, dressed in something new and expensive, talking loudly about investors and expansion. The wine flowed freely, bottles purchased on a line of credit they didn't realize was already tightening. My father carved the turkey like he always did, slow and ceremonial, as if the act itself confirmed his authority. He looked at me at the far end of the table, my posture straight, my legs steady. "You walking better?" he said. Not a question, an observation. "Yes," I replied. He nodded, satisfied, as if recovery had been inevitable, as if his refusal had never happened. At one point my sister lifted her glass. "Here's to working with partners who see our value," she said. "Not like those banks that only focus on numbers." Laughter followed, agreement, pride. I sipped my water and said nothing. They were celebrating on money I controlled in a house I owned while congratulating themselves for outsmarting a system they'd never bothered to understand. It was almost impressive. 3 weeks later, the first violation occurred. It wasn't dramatic, it never is. A payment was scheduled. The system sent reminders. Emails went unread. My father attempted to process it online late one evening, assumed it went through, and went to bed feeling accomplished. It hadn't. By the time he realized the mistake the next morning, it was too late. The clause didn't care about intent. It didn't care about excuses. It cared about timestamps. At 12:01 a.m., the lease terminated. By 8 a.m., notices were filed. I watched the confirmation populate on my screen, clean and irreversible. Then I scheduled the meeting. The intermediary framed it as a routine compliance review. My parents arrived irritated, not worried. They were 20 minutes late, complaining about traffic, demanding coffee. "Where's the senior partner?" my father asked, annoyed. "We don't have time for junior staff." I was already seated when I turned my chair to face them. For a second they didn't recognize me. Then my sister's smile collapsed. My mother's face drained of color. My father stared, mouth opening and closing, searching for a version of reality where this made sense. "Hello," I said evenly. "Mom, Dad." Silence pressed in around us, thick and heavy. "I'll be handling this," I continued. "I'm the owner." The words landed exactly where I'd aimed them. My father surged forward, anger flashing hot and immediate. "This is a joke." "No," I replied. "It's a contract." I laid everything out slide by slide. The debt purchase, the missed payment, the clause they hadn't read. My mother began to cry, not the composed tears she used in public, but something raw and panicked. "You tricked us," she whispered. I shook my head. "You signed." Security stepped closer as my father raised his voice, threats spilling out faster than he could control them. He said things he couldn't take back. He mentioned accounts he shouldn't have. I listened. When he finished, I placed a single document on the table. "I reported that," I said quietly, "weeks ago." The room went still. Outside, the air was cold and clean when I stepped out. I took a full breath, weight evenly distributed on both feet. I pulled out my phone and called my brother. "Pack your things," I told him. "I bought the shop." There was silence, then disbelief, then laughter through tears. I ended the call and stood there for a moment, feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not revenge. Resolution. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It never does. Collapse is usually quiet, a series of small sounds people ignore until the silence afterward is impossible to deny. After the meeting, my parents didn't go home. They couldn't. By the time they arrived, the locks had already been scheduled to change. The notice was taped cleanly to the front door, printed on heavy paper, the language formal and unforgiving. No raised voices, no scene for the neighbors, just procedure. My mother called first. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was long, fractured, full of half-finished sentences. She cried, then tried to sound reasonable, then cried again. She said words like family and misunderstanding, and how could you? She never said I'm sorry. My father's call came next. No tears, just rage. "You think you're clever?" he snarled. "You think this makes you powerful?" I listened without interrupting, the way I'd been trained to do during debriefs. Let people talk. They always reveal more than they mean to. He threatened lawsuits. He threatened public humiliation. He threatened to expose me to people who would set me straight. Then inevitably he bragged. "There's money you don't know about," he said. "Accounts you'll never touch. Offshore. Protected." I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. When he finished, I spoke for the first time. "I know," I said. "That's why I filed the report." Silence. The line went dead. 2 hours later, my attorney texted me a single sentence: "Agents are on site." I sat down slowly the way you do when your body realizes something significant has shifted. Not from adrenaline, from relief. My sister tried a different approach. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, makeup, perfect eyes red-rimmed, just enough to look sympathetic. She knocked like she used to when she wanted something soft, rhythmic, confident I'd open. I didn't. She talked through the door. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "We could have worked something out." I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, listening. "You always do this," she continued. "You take things too far. You make everything so extreme." I laughed once quietly. "Extreme," I repeated, "like refusing $5,000 for surgery." Her voice sharpened. "That's not fair." "No," I agreed, "it never was." She left after a while. I watched her through the peephole heels, clicking angrily down the hall phone already in her hand, calling someone else to fix what she'd broken. That evening I went for a walk. No crutches, no brace, just my legs steady beneath me, moving through cool air and falling leaves. Every step felt deliberate, earned. I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who signed a loan with shaking hands because no one else would show up, the one who swallowed disappointment and called it maturity. I thought about my brother. He'd arrived at the shop that morning to find his name on the door, not as an employee, as the owner. The look on his face when I told him he'd never have to sell his tools again, that was the moment everything felt worth it. "You didn't have to," he kept saying. "I know," I told him. "I wanted to." Family, I'd learned, wasn't who raised you. It was who refused to let you bleed alone. Over the next few days, the story spread in fragments. Neighbors whispered. Friends asked careful questions. My parents tried to control the narrative, but narratives collapse under evidence. Accounts were frozen. Investigations opened. The house, my house now, was quiet, empty of the life my parents had curated so carefully. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something calmer, cleaner. They hadn't been destroyed by me. They'd been undone by their own arrogance, their certainty that rules existed for other people. All I'd done was stop protecting them from the consequences. One afternoon, as I finished a therapy session and stepped outside into the sunlight, my therapist called after me. "You walk like someone who trusts herself again," he said. I smiled. "I do," I replied. The house stayed empty longer than I expected. I thought there would be noise, lawyers, accusations, public scenes. Instead, there was a strange quiet that settled over everything like dust after a building comes down. My parents disappeared from their old routines. The lunch club canceled their membership. The marina reassigned the slip. Friends stopped calling, unsure which side of the story they were supposed to believe. That silence told me more than any argument ever could. I focused on my recovery. Not just physical, but internal, the kind that doesn't show up on scans or charts. I returned to duty, gradually following protocol, earning back trust the right way. My commanding officer didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He watched how I moved, how I carried myself, and nodded once. "You're good," he said, clear-headed. I was. One evening, my brother and I closed up the shop together. The place smelled like oil and metal and fresh paint. He'd repainted the walls himself, hung the tools he'd replaced one by one. There was pride in his movements now, a lightness I'd never seen before. "They came by," he said casually, wiping his hands on a rag. I froze. "Who?" "Mom and Dad," he replied. "Didn't come in, just stood across the street for a while." I pictured it instantly. My father's rigid posture. My mother's hands clasped too tight. The building they'd never noticed before because it didn't fit their definition of success. "What did they want?" I asked. He shrugged, didn't ask. We locked up and stepped outside. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the air sharp and clean. "I told them this place wasn't theirs," he added after a moment. "Told them they should leave." I looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said gently, "I did." A week later, I received a formal notice from my attorney. Charges were moving forward. Timelines were set. Nothing sensational, just the machinery of accountability grinding on, patient and relentless. My mother tried one last time. She sent a letter, handwritten, pages of it. I read it slowly once, then again. She wrote about how hard things had been, about how she'd done her best, about how families make mistakes. She wrote about forgiveness as if it were something owed, something transactional. At the end, she wrote, "I hope one day you understand why we did what we did." I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I understood perfectly. They'd chosen comfort over compassion, image over integrity, a vote over their daughter's ability to walk. Understanding didn't require reconciliation. That night, I stood on my balcony and stretched my leg, feeling the solid strength of it beneath me. I thought about the version of myself who'd once believed love was something you earned by being easy, by not asking too much. That belief was gone. In its place was something steadier, quieter, self-respect. The final meeting happened on a Tuesday. My parents arrived separately this time. No unity, no performance, just two people carrying the weight of their own decisions. My father didn't look at me when I entered the room. My mother did, and then looked away. The attorney reviewed the terms, the outcomes, the consequences. There was no drama left to mine. When it was over, my father finally spoke. "You didn't have to ruin us," he said hoarsely. I met his gaze level and calm. "I didn't ruin you," I replied. "I stopped saving you." He flinched as if struck. Outside, the air was crisp. Fall had deepened while I wasn't paying attention. Leaves crunched underfoot as I walked to my car, each step sure, unbroken. I thought of the night I'd sat bleeding through gauze phone pressed to my ear, being told it wasn't a good time. I thought of the $800 in my brother's hands. And I knew without doubt that I'd gone exactly far enough. I didn't expect closure to feel so ordinary. There was no final confrontation in the rain, no dramatic apology, no moment where everyone suddenly understood each other and embraced. Life didn't work that way, especially not after the kind of choices my parents had made. What there was instead was distance. Weeks passed, then months. My parents stopped calling altogether. My sister vanished into whatever smaller orbit she'd landed in her online presence, quiet, carefully curated optimism, replacing the old confidence. I heard about them only through second-hand updates that arrived without emotion like weather reports. I didn't ask for more. My world had narrowed in a good way. Mornings started early again. Boots on, uniform pressed. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders, not as a burden, but as something earned. I ran for the first time 6 months after surgery on a cool morning when the base was still quiet. My stride was careful at first, then longer, smoother. My leg held, strong, reliable. I slowed to a walk and laughed out loud, the sound surprising me as much as anyone who might have overheard. That laugh belonged to someone new. My brother thrived in ways I'd always known he could if someone just got out of his way. The shop expanded. He hired 2 apprentices. He stopped apologizing for taking up space. One night over takeout eaten on overturned crates, he looked at me and shook his head. "You know," he said, "I still can't believe you did all that." "I didn't do it alone," I replied. He smiled. "No, but you finished it." That mattered more than he knew. I thought often about the word family, how easily it's used, how rarely it's examined. Growing up, I'd believed family meant endurance, loyalty at any cost, silence as proof of love. I know better now. Family is who shows up when there's blood on the floor, who doesn't ask whether it's convenient, who doesn't turn your pain into a lesson. My parents had chosen a boat over my leg, image over integrity, comfort over compassion. They hadn't just refused money, they'd refused to see me. And in doing so, they'd given me something unexpected: clarity. I didn't become cruel, I didn't become vengeful, I became precise. I used the same system they'd trusted to protect themselves. I followed the rules they'd ignored. I let consequences do what arguments never could. Some people will say I went too far. Maybe they're right from the perspective of those who've never been told their suffering was inconvenient, from those who've never had to choose between dignity and survival. But here's what I know. I can walk without pain. I can sleep without resentment. And I can look at myself in the mirror without wondering why I wasn't enough. That's not revenge, that's freedom. If you're listening to this and something in it stirred, if you've ever been the dependable one, the quiet one, the one who was told to endure, because you always could, I want you to know this. You're not weak for needing help, and you're not wrong for stopping the cycle. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think I went too far or just far enough? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. We share stories like this every day, stories about justice, second chances, and what happens when the underestimated stop playing by rules that were never meant to protect them. Subscribe if you'd like to keep walking this road with us. You're not alone.